Hi, everybody. Hope we're drying out. It was wet last night, too, but not after Professor Ogletree got going. You forget about the weather pretty quick. So this is the third and final of the Huggins lectures, sponsored by the DuBose Institute. And the first one took us through the intersection of race and Obama's earlier life. Then last night, we followed him and race, I don't know why they're so intersected, through the campaign and then the wonderful, I guess we ended with that wonderful photograph at Grant Park, which still to me is one of the great photographs of all time. You have your programs, and so most of you are here because you already know Charles or know about him. I think I'm not going to talk about all of his awards. What I think anybody who knows Charles feels about him is that you cannot have a better friend. You just can't. And he's one of those few people that Harvard can't spoil. So I thought the way I'd like to introduce him is to read a passage from one of his distinguished colleagues here at Harvard, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, who wrote about Charles and many others, in her book, I've Known Rivers, which, if you haven't read, you should. And this is just a small little portrait of our speaker. My impulse is to look backward, not forward, said Charles Ogletree, as he begins his story, to give back something to the people I came from. In our final session, he echoes the same theme, his voice thick with emotion. There is no way I could be as successful as I am without close and constant contact with home people. I'm on their shoulders. It is the way I survive. For Charles, home is anchor, home is identity, home is survival. Home is the poor, rural community in Merced, California, where he grew up. Home is fishing in the same river as his grandfather, returning to speak at the local churches, or to attend a high school reunion. Home is both responsibility and liberation. Unless he continues to remain deeply connected with his community, Charles believes that his life will be without purpose or meaning. His personal liberation is tied up with the collective survival of his childhood community. And so now, as we move into the final lecture in the Huggins series, it's my pleasure and yours to welcome Charles Ogletree.
Ike, thanks so much. I just keep having my dear friends give these eulogies. I just don't know what it is, this emotional history, but it is. And I want to thank my colleague and dear friend, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, who chose me as one of her subjects in this book called I've Known Rivers, which was a remarkable, and is a remarkable book about the lives of a number of people. My wife Pam is here, and it was amazing. I told Sarah things I had never told anyone else. It was one of those, she's that, a good listener as opposed to always questioning you. She lets you talk and think about it, and things that I put aside for decades, buried. She opened it up in another way and created a remarkable experience. That book actually was printed years ago. And what makes it so interesting, it was before Anita Hill, so it was before I represented Anita Hill's early 1990s, before Derek Bell left Harvard. And so it was like the first half of my life, before I had tenure. Yeah, exactly, right? So it was an interesting book, and she was able to get, I think, some very candid responses. What I wanted to do today is to sort of end this series of three conversations about President Barack Obama. I wanted to step back for a minute. I think we have those photos, Louis, right? The three? Okay. To just take a look at an interesting historic aspect of Obama. And you see this photograph of him more recently. And my premise hasn't changed, that the issue of race has become more difficult the more he's been involved in national politics, and certainly since he has been the President of the United States. And yet, not every negative comment about President Barack Obama, who we talk about today, is racist or necessarily about race. There are some people who just don't like him. They don't like him because he's a Democrat. They don't like him because he's the president and they want someone else to be president. They don't like him because he really won an unprecedented number of states in the 2008 election. The fear was, a realistic fear, that he might win even more in 2012. And they don't like the fact that he spent a lot of money to keep the government from going through another, and the people from going through another depression and recession, and spent a lot, and maybe not enough, some would argue, but a lot, billions and billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, to try to stabilize the losses that were predicted in 2009, 10, and 11. And they don't understand that the problem didn't start with Barack Obama. They were long before him, which is very incredible. Now, the interesting thing is that I've got my mentors here, people like Florence Ledd and Preston Williams, and particularly Bill Wilson, who is, as I said, another Chicagoan. And I was hoping he wouldn't be here tonight, but he is, because when I told him that I was going to use the conundrum of race, nobody understands it. I never use words like that in my books. They're all bestsellers. Well, so I'm sneaking this word in, Bill, just to have a conversation. I think somebody knows what the conundrum means, and I hope that won't be a barrier to, I don't want to read the conundrum, that's just too complicated. And it really is a device for me to cover up some of the range of issues I'm going to be talking about in terms of President Obama and the challenges that he has, that he's facing now. And one of the things that I wanted to do is to take a step back before going through the candidate's life. And one of the amazing things, and I think they want us to turn the lights down during these presentations, I want you to just recall two things. You remember a few years ago, there was a remarkable candidate for the Democratic nomination, and he was considered invincible. His name was Dr. Howard Dean, right? And you remember he was what everyone thought. Here's the change, here's the hope. This guy is amazing. And then it's amazing how television can do this, and then he lost Iowa, you may remember. You remember his comments after losing that? We're going to take, yeah. And everybody said, this guy's crazy, right? It just worked against him. But one of the most interesting things that I saw that I didn't get a chance to talk about yesterday was how then Senator Obama responded to the significance of losing in New Hampshire to Hillary Clinton, and how everyone at his rally in New Hampshire was depressed. We've lost it. We have no chance. And this, to me, is one of the great moments in his life where he, not they, he lifted everybody up. The loser lifted everybody up, and people didn't see what happened as a loss. And what makes it even more remarkable, some of you may know, he came to Boston the next day, and my wife, Pam, and I, and a number of people saw him, and we were trying to cheer him up, and he was the most cheerful person in the room, saying that, you know, this was a remarkable evening last night. And Michelle, my wife, he said, asked me how I felt about losing. And he said, I didn't feel bad at all, because we needed that. We were soaring too high, as Pam reported it. And we were like Icarus, that we were soaring high and that nothing can stop us. And I had to bring the people down to a level. And that is Obama. He's always modulated, right? And that was a significant point. When everyone else was down, he says, I'm not going to get too high. I'm not going to get too low. I'm going to be very keen about how I'm going to address these issues. And I want you to listen to this speech, because it touches everything. And look at the people behind him, how depressed they are when he starts. And then, if we go back again, how it turns out that he ultimately, where's Derek, where he ultimately is a cheerleader for progress that makes enormous amount of difference. And I would just say one different thing before I get to Skip Gates. He didn't abandon us today. He's seen his doctor in New York for his medical issues. He didn't run from the fact that I'm going to show something about the beer summit. That was not his run. I want to make that clear. Skip Gates decided not to come because Ogletree is going to talk about the beer summit. That's not the case. I did it again, Derek. But I wanted to show this Yes We Can speech to give you a little sense of his both solicitude and approval of Hillary Clinton, and yet some of the other things that he had to say to try to make the people understand that this was a momentous moment and we shouldn't give up, and it became the trademark of the campaign. You may remember also that Bill Clinton, with all of the challenges coming to him in the early 1990s and doing very well in Iowa, was called the comeback kid, but they both have that same kind of quality that might make a difference. Let's see if this is going to work.
Safety mode, so it's not referencing external media, so you should close out the PowerPoint and then reopen it again, and then enable content. Should be a yellow bar.
Okay. Here we go. It has to catch up, right?
We know the battle ahead will be long, but always remember that no matter what obstacles stand in our way, nothing can stand in the way of the power of millions of voices calling for change. We have been told we cannot do this by a chorus of cynics, and they will only grow louder and more dissonant in the weeks and months to come. We've been asked to pause for a reality check. We've been warned against offering the people of this nation false hope. But in the unlikely story that is America, there has never been anything false about hope. For when we have faced down impossible odds, when we've been told we're not ready, or that we shouldn't try, or that we can't, generations of Americans have responded with a simple creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared the destiny of a nation. Yes, we can. It was whispered by slaves and abolitionists as they blazed a trail towards freedom through the darkest of nights. Yes, we can. It was sung by immigrants as they struck out from distant shores and pioneers who pushed westward against an unforgiving wilderness. Yes, we can. It was the call of workers who organized, women who reached for the ballot, a president who chose the moon as our new frontier, and a king who took us to the mountaintop and pointed the way to the promised land. Yes, we can to justice and equality. Yes, we can to opportunity and prosperity. Yes, we can heal this nation. Yes, we can repair this world. Yes, we can. And so tomorrow, as we take the campaign south and west, as we learn that the struggles of the textile workers in Spartanburg are not so different than the plight of the dishwasher in Las Vegas, that the hopes of the little girl who goes to the crumbling school in Dillon are the same as the dreams of the boy who learns on the streets of L.A. We will remember that there is something happening in America, that we are not as divided as our politics suggest, that we are one people, we are one nation, and together we will begin the next great chapter in the American story with 3 words that will ring from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea. Yes, we can. Thank you, New Hampshire. Thank you.
Now, what's interesting about that, you get a sense of how critical it was for Barack Obama, again, as I said the last 2 nights. He's talking to a fired up Democratic audience, but he's talking to the world. He's talking to everybody. You know, one nation, one people. And every time I watch this tape, it's very emotional, because I remember watching it that night. It's like, how can this guy have the spirit of success and hope and change after getting drubbed like other people in New Hampshire, meaning it was over? And this is a part of him that I think that underlies all of this sense about Obama, that this is not about race, it's about him pulling himself up and pulling us up. Because a lot of us were, you know, he's too new, he's a novice, he's not well known, and one false step was going to be the destruction of Barack Obama. In fact, what it was the catalyst for change and created an enormous amount of support. The second sort of issue with President Obama has nothing to do with race. But as I said before, President Obama encountered problems before he even took the oath. And this is one that I found very interesting. I want you to watch his reaction as Chief Justice John Roberts is giving him the oath, and see whether this smart man understands there's a mistake being made. And the Chief Justice saying, no, say what I say. Absolutely.
Are you prepared to take the oath, Senator?
I am.
I, Barack Hussein Obama,
I,
do solemnly swear
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
that I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully,
that I will execute
the office of President of the
the office
United
of President of
States,
the United States faithfully,
and will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President. All the best wishes.
Now, what's interesting about that is some of you know, I hope all of you know now, the 2 things. First, the Vice President, Joe Biden, was sworn in first. He was sworn in by the senior justice on the Supreme Court, who was Justice John Paul Stevens. What's interesting about it is that Justice John Paul Stevens, 85 years old then, took the written transcript of what you say for the oath so he couldn't blow it, right? But, you know, Chief Justice John Roberts, a very bright man, I've memorized this, I've got this. And you can see the first day, now the story that will be expanded is that we then had the reception at the White House for the president and then the other events. And I talked to 2 classmates who were working for the president at the time, Chris Etley, who's now the dean at UC Berkeley Law School, and Cass Sunstein, who's a senior official in several aspects of the administration. I told both of them, I said, there's going to be a story tomorrow in the Wall Street Journal and Fox News that the president is not president because he didn't properly take the oath. And they said, what? I said, I'm just kidding. But you know what they did? Chief Justice John Roberts came back to the White House and gave it officially again, because as we anticipated, there would be challenges. I told you he's a Muslim. I told you he's so-and-so. I told you he's not president, right? And so it worked out well in that sense. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit now, because this is part of the service that he carried. And this is one of the first interesting issues, and I wrote about this in the book about Professor Gates. And this is him confronting an issue about police. I told you before, he was very keen about police and racial profiling. And 2, about friendship. And it may have been one of the greatest mistakes of his early presidency, because this happened, you may remember, Professor Gates was arrested wrongfully on Thursday, July 16, 2009, And then President Obama was giving what you might expect, a wonderful press conference on health care in 2009, a few days later. And he was terrific, talking about all the aspects of it. He had enough votes in the Senate. He had enthusiasm from the House, even though he didn't have a public option. And the very last question that was asked of him was by Lynn Sweet from Chicago, a reporter from Chicago. And he didn't ask for this question, as you'll hear somebody claim he did. It was just a question, what do you think about the arrest of Gates? And I want you to hear how he answered it. And my sense was after the first two things he said, he should have stopped. When he said, Skip Gates is my friend, and I don't know all the facts. And I say something disparaging after that, my wife won't let me say it. So, but the point of the matter is that you shouldn't say anything more, Mr. President. But he did say something more. And we'll see how this turned into the major issue of race in this campaign.
I don't know, not having been there and not seeing all the facts, what role race played in that. But I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home. And number three, what I think we know separate and apart from this incident is that there is a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately.
Now, what's interesting about that is that it has a number of elements in it. And here's the president trying to speak candidly about something he deeply believes in. You know, we have to make sure the police don't get involved in wrongfully charging people with crimes, racial profiling. He did introduce legislation in Illinois, as I said before, about racial profiling. And as he said before, Skip Gates was his friend. So it seemed like a good thing. But what happened is that, if you heard it, when he said the first 5 words, the Cambridge police acted stupidly, everybody nodded, and that's when it said, this is a race issue, right? Because he became, at that very moment, he became not the president of the United States who happened to be black, he became the black president. He'd taken sides, a Harvard-educated president with a Harvard-teaching friend, Skip Gates, against a hard-working class police officer who happened to be white. And the two things happened after that. The one thing is that he was widely criticized for what he said. And then the second thing, you see our good friend Glenn Beck, he was widely criticized about what he said, but the second thing was that African Americans applauded the fact that he talked about, and Latinos talked about racial profiling. It was a real issue that had not been talked about as candidly by a sitting president in the height of this. And it gave them reassurances that he understood what was really going on. Well, not everyone appreciated what he had to say, and Glenn Beck is one of the people who immediately went on and told a little bit about Barack Obama and his views.
The president, I think, has exposed himself as a guy over and over and over again who has a deep-seated hatred for white people or the white culture. I don't know what it is.
You can't say he doesn't like white people. David Axelrod's white. Rahm Emanuel's his chief of staff are white. I think 70% of the people that we see every day are white. Robert Gibbs is white.
I'm not saying that he doesn't like white people. I'm saying he has a problem. This guy is, I believe, a racist.
So he doesn't, I'm not saying he doesn't like white people, he's a racist. So, but the thing about it, it struck a chord, right? A lot of people tried to figure out a way to oppose Obama, and this was a convenient one because of the fact that he had that kind of appeal, and this was a way to criticize him. And the reality, as you'll see in the ultimate book, is that Glenn Beck's ratings went up astronomically. Right, he was reprimanded by Fox News, but his ratings went up, and his following went up. So every time someone talks about, yesterday we talked about African Americans criticizing him on race, here are whites criticizing him on race and seeing how that responds. Here is his State of the Union address, not really State of the Union address, this is his address about health care. And you'll hear this comment by a member of Congress who's sitting listening to it, and says something unprecedented.
Claim that our reform efforts would ensure illegal immigrants. This too is false. The reforms I'm proposing would not apply to those who are here illegally. It's not true. And one more. misunderstanding I want to clear up. Under our plan, no federal dollars will be used to fund abortions, and federal conscience laws will remain in place.
Now, what's interesting is that thinking about this is the whole issue of you lie, right? That has nothing to do with race in my point of view, right? But it struck a chord with people who were anti-Obama. That wasn't a racist claim, but it was very unusual, extremely unusual, for any member of Congress to interrupt a president given a major address and to challenge him on an issue like that. Now, what's the other upshot of it, why race does matter? Joe Wilson's ratings went up, contributions to his campaign went up. It was an amazing reaction. He's my kind of guy. He's challenging the president in some significant ways. But it got worse, and this is August 2009. There's no one like President Obama who's faced the sort of death threats as president. This is an article that was published right after, only within the first year of his service, 2009. Since Mr. Obama took office, the rate of threats against the president has increased 400% from the 3,000 a year or so under George W. Bush, according to Ronald Kessler, author of the President's Secret Service. Some threats to Obama, whose Secret Service code name is Renegade, have been publicized, including an alleged plot by white supremacists in Tennessee late last year, to rob a gun store, shoot 88 black people, decapitate another 14, and then assassinate the first black president in American history. So, I mean, it's deep-rooted in terms of how some people reacted to what he had to say. But the question is, how significant is it? And then a later report said that U.S. President Barack Obama is the target of more than 30 potential death threats a day and is being protected by an increasingly overstretched and under-resourced Secret Service, according to a new book. Since Obama took office, the rate of threats against the president has increased 400% from 3,000 or so under President George W. Bush, et cetera. And it talks about some of the other aspects of it. Now, here's where it gets sort of complicated. The reality about how people have looked at it, and it's described here as, quote, in a new wave of anti-government fervor threatened to overwhelm the Secret Service. Anti-government as opposed to Obama, but it happened. Here's some of the things here's one thing that I think tells us some of the other problems. You see a young Marine also talking about assassinating President Obama. And then, most of you heard just this week, a 21-year-old Idaho man suspected of firing a semi-automatic rifle at the White House was arrested today. Now, why is that important? Because there's a lot of talk in the last several years about the rate of increased hate crimes. Tom Perez, a Harvard Law School graduate and the head of the Civil Rights Division, said that there have been more hate crimes in the United States than ever since President Obama took office. But the reality is that hate crimes may have nothing to do with the president. For example, how can we say that what happened on Monday at the White House, the shooting, was a racist plot as opposed to an anti-government, anti-White House? And you have to be very careful. The number of hate crimes have increased, but that's because, remember, a person who shot up the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., does that have anything to do with Obama? Remember Dr. Tiller, who was assassinated for involved in abortions? And it's so easy to conflate all these things and put them together as if all this has happened because of the reaction to President Barack Obama. I think it's happening because of people's frustration with government. And it's too easy to make sure those things are crimes. Sometimes the president said some things that has had religious and other connotations. Most of you probably missed this, but this is at the White House. The president invited Muslims to the White House, as he invited other groups, and he talked about the holy holidays. And here's what he said, which created some fervor.
Attention's been focused on the construction of mosques in certain communities, particularly New York. Now, we must all recognize and respect the sensitivities surrounding the development of Lower Manhattan. The 9/11 attacks were a deeply traumatic event for our country. And the pain and the experience of suffering by those who lost loved ones is just unimaginable. So I understand the emotions that this issue engenders. And Ground Zero is indeed hallowed ground. But let me be clear. As a citizen and as president, I believe that Muslims have the right to practice their religion as everyone else in this country. And that includes the right to build a place of worship in a community center on private property in Lower Manhattan in accordance with local laws and ordinances. This is America, and our commitment to religious freedom must be unshakable. The principle that people of all faiths are welcome in this country and that they will not be treated differently by their government is essential to who we are. The writ of the founders must endure.
Now, what's interesting about that is, you know, it's clearly I'm concerned about 9/11 and about the people who lost their lives. But he said, you know, the Muslim community has a right to build a center anywhere they want to, in effect, right? Well, it took about 1 day of negative press for him to come back. I was not commenting, and I will not comment on the wisdom of making the decision to put a mosque there. I was commenting very specifically on the right people have that dates back to our founding. In this country, we treat everybody equally in accordance with the law, regardless of race, regardless of religion. Well, it blew up, right? It was an example of a heartfelt statement, but that's why people hate Barack Obama, right? You know, he ignores the desecration, some would say, of those who lost their life 9/11. He doesn't. He said he did. How much he was troubled by that. But that's how people began to see him in a narrow way. But here's what he has done. What I see is a remarkable thing, a remarkable set of things about his commitment to the same goals that he had from the beginning, to make America and make his cabinet and make the country and make the court look like America. The first was his appointment of Eric Holder, the first black attorney general. We've had people, deputy, et cetera, but in the history of our government, in the history of the Department of Justice, we've never had an African-American attorney general. That's significant because people have been close. There have been, you know, remember Wayne Budd, Associate Attorney General, who was very key to keeping the peace in 1991 after the beating of Rodney King. He flew out under George W. Bush H.W. Bush I, to Los Angeles to calm the fears. And when people saw a black man from the Department of Justice going out, there was a sense of, okay, they're serious about this. And there was a federal prosecution. Larry Thompson was the Deputy Attorney General under President Bush II and others. And you can see the significance of that. But this is the first time to make this change. And that tells you that these things mean something to him. I just had lunch with her an hour ago, 2 hours ago. Justice Sonia Sotomayor was not only doubling the number of women on the Supreme Court, but he picked as his first choice Latina for the Supreme Court, and an unusual Latina, someone who had been a prosecutor, who had been a district court judge, who had been a circuit court judge, and people examined thousands of her opinions, could not find a single opinion to show any bias or favoritism or empathy in one way that was unfair, and all they could comment on 2 different comments she made at panels. And I talked to her about that today. She says, I don't do any panels. And she gave a story, which is sort of strange, about simply being in New York with a girlfriend of hers and talking to her girlfriend about how she loved to make chicken stew. And then on the blog the next day, there was a photograph, just as Sotomayor says, she makes the best chicken stew in the world, right? And the whole idea, she can't say anything trapped. But I think his choice was quite significant. And then he did something that may not seem much to you, but for me as a lawyer, it was phenomenal. The Solicitor General's office is the most powerful office of law in the country. The Solicitor General is really called the 10th Justice. That's the person who helps persuade the Supreme Court on what should be the law in our country. And as long as we've had this Constitution and we've had the Supreme Court and we've had cases before our Supreme Court for hundreds of years, we've never, ever had a woman as a Solicitor General, even though half of the members of the profession are women and half of the members in law school now are women. How could we not find a qualified woman to be Solicitor General? And that's the kind of insight that he has about, it's not Elena Kagan's my friend, but I have to find among these qualified people, isn't there a brilliant woman who can do the same job that men have done for not just decades, but for centuries? And then, of course, he nominated Elena Kagan to be his second choice in the Supreme Court. You can debate all day, and we can debate. You know, why didn't he pick another black person to weigh against Justice Clarence Thomas? Why did he pick a black woman? There are some good candidates, and there are good candidates. And what about Elena Kagan? She's never argued before the Supreme Court. She's never argued in a circuit court, but she's a brilliant woman. And that was his choice because his point was he wasn't someone who had that brilliance. What else is important about her? When she was nominated, 50 years old. In fact, when she first heard from Chief Justice Roberts saying, congratulations, we'll be serving together for 25 years, she said, only 25? Right? Right? And so the sense is that the idea of age and wit, it's thinking that maybe most people don't understand. This was a remarkable choice because she will be there probably longer than anyone sitting on the Supreme Court right now. So his legacy is not just 4 years or 8 years, it's decades. And that's not different from what George W. Bush did when he appointed young justices. That's not different from Ronald Reagan did when he appointed young justices. That's not different from what Lyndon Baines Johnson did when he appointed Thurgood Marshall in 1967. And that's, everybody wants to have a legacy, no matter what it is, but that's another one of the great things. And here's what I say, against some objection, I mentioned it yesterday, I think the most significant and forward-looking thing that President Obama did as president was to nominate Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State. It took a bold stroke to do that because there was enormous amount of resentment among progressive Democrats who thought Senator Clinton had been too tough, had been dismissive, had been critical of Obama. How could he share the same office with this woman in his cabinet after she was so hard and critical throughout the campaign? But it showed how strong he is in terms of saying, I want the best person out there. And that may mean that he's not as political as some others, but this is an interesting choice that took the personal persuasion for it to happen, and he did it very effectively. And here are some of the things he did that's interesting. And I think part of this debate, and Bill Wilson is the center of this from my point of view, the things he did with the economy and what he tried to do, maybe they weren't enough, but they are pretty significant. There were $787 billion saying, I want you, Congress, to give the states $787 billion to split among them to build roads, bridges, to repair our environment, right? It was remarkable. You should do what I do. When I speak in almost any city or state, I ask people in the audience, well, I'll do it right here. How many people were aware of the stimulus package that the president passed? Hands go up, right? Now, let me ask the second question. That was about 40 hands. How many people are aware of how many billions of dollars came to Massachusetts? Raise your hand. One and one half, right? You think I'm going to ask you how much, right? And how much came to the city of Cambridge? Who knows? City of Boston. You see, that's interesting. The other thing that followed it, when you talk about jobs and economics, more than a dozen governors from around the country said, we don't want the money. Now, how many times governors tell the federal government, we don't want the money? We don't want billions of dollars to put our folks back to work. But he heard that from where? South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana. State after Georgia, state after state after state. Most of those were Republican governors, and their point was, we've got to stop this guy. We don't want people thinking that he's doing something good for us. And his point was the same one that our governor of Massachusetts had, that I'm going to use this money not just to hire people, I'm going to use it for skilled workers, use it for semi-skilled workers, and as Bill Wilson has written about, for unskilled workers. Unskilled workers are not necessarily people without skills. They're people who may not have a credential, or may not be part of a union, but they know how to pave a road. They know how to build a fence. They know how to cut grass. They know how to drive a truck, but they may not be certified. But the whole idea is that you've got to reach the bottom up. Now, he never said, and will never say, the stimulus package was designed to lift the bottom up and give more African Americans and Latinos and poor people work. He won't say that, right? But the question is whether or not it drips down. If you look at the same time, the health care reform bill. You remember the young brother who was in the photograph when he signed the bill. It is, as I said last night, it's before the Supreme Court now, and they are going to commit 5.5 hours. They've never done that in the history of the Supreme Court. 5.5 hours to debate the various cases from various jurisdictions about health care. I'll tell you my view. There's no shame in my game. I think the Supreme Court's going to pass it. It is not, as most people think, a left-right issue like abortion and civil rights. It really is an issue about what does the Commerce Clause mean and how do you interpret it? And you might be surprised to see that there's a variety of points of view on that, and that I'm not as fearful as some people are at the Supreme Court. The conservative Supreme Court will strike this down as Obamacare. I think they're going to look at it in terms of whether or not under Commerce Clause that Congress has power and the president can support this by signing the bill. And I expect that it will be almost totally, if not totally, affirmed as the law of the land, or the court could also say we don't have jurisdiction because it really doesn't take full effect until 2014, which is after the 2012 election, and so it won't matter because some of these provisions will take into effect almost 3 years from now. And that's sort of a sense of the great things that he's done. And here's one of the interesting and maybe not as successful thing, the jobs bill sounded great, millions of dollars, et cetera, that he was proposing. And then Congress did not pass it. It just gives you a sense of some of that, some of the problems. And here is one of the things I was going to say. One of the things that make me so proud of what he's done as the president is something that most people who are not lawyers wouldn't know about or pay attention to. He has created positions on courts throughout this country, on the circuit court, which is one heartbeat away from the Supreme Court, where we have the most diverse court at the federal level that we've ever had, more than any other president in terms of his appointments. We had the first appointment of a person, an African American, to the First Circuit. That's Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, other places, and that's Roger Lee Thompson, an African American woman appointed to the First Circuit. It's never happened before. There's a Haitian man appointed to the Second Circuit, which is New York and other northeastern cases. Third Circuit, he's appointed Joe Greenaway, a classmate a couple of years behind here from Harvard. Fourth Circuit, there are 4 African Americans. And the Fourth Circuit, you may remember, was the most resistant circuit. This is North Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina. You can see how complicated that was. Maryland, and now the majority of the people on that court are people of color. And he's appointed the first ever openly gay judges to the circuit courts, and now, of course, they're going to stop the appointments, right? But we don't know if he's going to be reelected. And any party, I'm not saying this is bad for the Republicans, any party is going to stop a president from appointing new justices and judges the year of an election. We did it, right? Trying to keep Bush from appointing people, and we did it trying to get Clinton to appoint people, even though it's people say you're a lame duck president until the election. So that's part of his success because, thank you, he's appointing people who will be serving for decades long after he's gone, which means that there's a pool now of talented, gifted, extraordinary women and men who are on the federal courts who are one heartbeat away from the Supreme Court, and that means they could be there in very short order. Here's the current data, which is very interesting. I want to end on this about his challenge of what he has to do. In polls with him and Romney, with him and Perry, with him and Herman Cain, with him and John Huntsman, with him and Michelle Bachmann, with him and there's one more. Rick Perry, did I say Perry? Newt Gingrich, right. You know, it's interesting. He's doing well against all those Republican challenges, except one. No, it's not Huntsman. He's doing one. It's the Republican to be named later, right? Which is very interesting. Why does that make sense, right? It makes sense because it's saying we know they may not be able to beat him, but we believe that a Republican can and shall and will beat him. And he doesn't poll as well against the unknown Republican who's not in the race because people are unhappy with all the others, and we'll see. And again, I don't think this is as much about race. What I didn't say, but which would be in the book, was talking about the interesting aspect of we thought up until a few weeks ago. What happens when you have an African American running for president on the Republican side and an African American running for president on the Democratic side? And Herman Cain, a Morehouse man, had that mystery, right? Because he said things that people were afraid to fight back. He said that blacks were brainwashed because they supported Democrats, not the Republicans. He said a lot, and if people don't have a job, it's their fault because their job's available and that they just have to have the skill. A lot of things. And McCain has sort of slowly disappeared from the horizon. Newt Gingrich's run come up considerably more. And it's very interesting. But here's the final data point that's very interesting, that looking at all the data about Obama, even with all these issues of race and religion in the 21st century, particularly since he's been elected, it's fascinating that he still polls better than anyone else despite that. And the issues are two. One, are people going to come out and vote, right? And two, are they going to see a difference between his opponent and him in terms of what America should look like in January 2013? And I think that's going to be the issue, and we'll know more about it shortly. And the interesting thing is that compared to 2008, you saw the map yesterday, Barack Obama did a remarkable job in states where no one expected any Democrat to win, and certainly not an African-American Democrat. He won Virginia. He won North Carolina. He won Florida. He won Ohio. He won Pennsylvania. He won New Jersey. He won Indiana. And all those states are back in play again because of the economy. And the question is, how will he do and how can he do in those states again? He's been smart, as I said, by going right now as president to those states and talking about the challenges that they face, and that's going to be the issue. So the bottom line is that there's an enormous amount. I don't know if those slides are here, the other three. Hillary Clinton, Louis Myers. Is Louis here? Are the slides here? Okay. The final thing I want to say is very interesting in thinking about what President Obama is going to be able to do and what it means for him in 2012. But the most interesting aspect of all of this is that he's going to have a tough challenge. And he's going to have, unfortunately, the challenge of staying away from the issue of race as much as people want him to engage it more. And he still is going to be committed to what some of you criticize, his view that I'm trying to bring all of America together until there's a shortcoming. He can't possibly do that. What I wanted to end with is that in 2005, I had the honor of being the moderator of the Democratic National, it wasn't a Democratic National Committee, the Congressional Black Caucus's legislative weekend, September 2005. This is the year after Obama is in the Senate, Hillary Clinton's in the Senate. And I didn't know it. Louis Myrie, who's a photographer, I said something that I just threw away because the last two people to come to the stage were Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And I said, I'm sure my wife would chastise me, said, well, ladies and gentlemen, here is the team for the 2008 ticket for Democrats. Senator Hillary Clinton, Senator Barack Obama. I'm not saying who's going to be first or second on the ticket, but here's the ticket. And everybody went crazy, of course. And then, of course, it turns out that they too were there. And this is part of that. The other photos aren't on here, but I had a friendly relationship with Senator Clinton and also with Senator Obama. But it was interesting that even then, as much as people didn't talk about it, there was this extraordinary ability of someone to be different. And the question is how that difference is going to play in terms of what he's going to be able to do going forward. So I'm going to cut so the reality is that here is the challenge that we are facing when we talk about in the book is that how much is the issue of race going to be a help and a hindrance in 2012, and it's going to be, I think, the issue. Bill, it's going to be the conundrum of 2012 that affects President Obama's ability to get elected. And I'll stop there. Thank you much. I'm going to put that picture of Obama back on, just with him.
Well, we're going to have some questions for Charles, and if any of you have heard him, he's one of the great answers to questions. I had just a quick question.
Sure.
So the three lectures tell us that this is a man who's not going to play the race card.
Right.
Is he going to play the class card?
He already has.
But you think he's played it as much as he's going to play it?
I think that the class card's complicated because every candidate, unless you go back to who was a candidate from Wisconsin in 1972 that some of us voted for? For President McGovern, right? McGovern used the word poor. If you look at elections in the 80s and 90s and the 21st century, what did they use the word? Middle class, working, right? And so if you're going to play the class card, no one is really talking about the poor, because the assumption, which is a wrong one, is the poor don't vote, don't matter, don't care, they can't influence what we do. And so I think in light of what's happened, it's going to be inevitable that he's going to have to find a way to address the issue, not just of working people, but what's shifted is that we don't have the middle class the way we did just 5 years ago. I mean, there are people who are making $120,000 in 2008 who are homeless now. I mean, it's not that they've gone from 120 to 80, they're homeless. They've lost their home. And that tells you, so you have to have those folks are angry. Those are the letters he's reading about folks, why me? Why did I lose my job, right? Why am I not able to get a job? And that's part of what will have to be addressed. So I think the class thing is going to be important. And the reason the race thing is complicated is that you can see in a lot of his addresses, and I've been to a lot of them, when I missed the one because of Gates, when he talked to NAACP, he talked about race. When I was at the Congressional Black Caucus, when he talked about race and what we had to do in terms of marching, without saying that. When he was talking about the Jeremiah generation down in the South, he talked about race. When he's at the Martin Luther King Memorial event on October 16th, he talked about King and the importance of those issues, right? And so it's a very complicated, complex issue, but we'll see whether he can find a way to raise it. Microphone? Is there a microphone? There you go.
So, Tree, where does this, assuming that the president wins, where does this put Black America in 2016? I know we're not a forward-thinking group as a rule, but
no,
where does that put us?
Let me just, I don't know what the teams will look like in 2016, but I think I'm very optimistic about what can happen in the next 4 years. Right, absolutely, number one. Number two, if Obama wins and if the economy in some way stabilizes, I think it's going to be very interesting to see the choices that Americans have to make for president in 2016. It's not beyond belief after 2008 that the person nominated in 2016 could be a Latino or African American, and she will do an extraordinary job if elected in 2016. And I say that for a number of reasons because, and you and I have talked about this, there has to be both some focus and recognition on the suffering and the misery index that impacts the poorest community, number one, and that's what Bill Wilson's right about work and class. And at the same time, you can't lift the bottom up without lifting us up, right? We're and part of it. And I don't think you have to be afraid to say that, right? If you pass health care, it's going to benefit people who don't have it or who don't have enough options with it or who don't have the range of coverage that they should have. That's going to be us. And so that's the point is going to be how does that make an enormous amount of difference. And the last thing is that there are a lot of us, adult African-American men in particular, who are unemployed, who are employable, and who can work. And what, as you know, what happened in our city, in the city of Boston, hopefully I'm trying to make it a bellwether for cities around the country. You can't stop people from working because they've had a prior record. You can stop them from certain kinds of jobs. People should be able to paint fences, cut grass, drive pickup trucks, deliver, pave roads, all those things. And we've got to figure out a way, if we're talking about what he's talking about, get those jobs available to folks like this. And I had a conversation with a prominent person, very prominent person in business, about why can't we get 20,000 African Americans in Detroit in that 20-year-old age to work in X. I won't say what the X was, but it was an industry that didn't require special training, special dedication, but it did require the union not being an impediment to employing the most needy in the community. And that has to be a voice that we're hearing more and more from the president, from Congress, that we've got to find a way to lift folks up. Yes.
I would like for you to say a little more about the category of the conundrum of race in the following way.
Mm-hmm.
Herman Cain, Clarence Thomas, Obama.
Are you asking me, are they related?
No, no, no. I'm getting to the question.
Okay.
Okay. So we could say that all of them are African Americans, or talk about race.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that we could say that Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Hitler were white. At what point does race as a category lose its explanatory power? That's what I thought you were going to talk about when you talked about the conundrum of race at this point.
Well, you'll hear more about it, but here's the problem. Here's part of the problem. I am firmly convinced that we aren't, nor will we become post-racial, which is the first complaint, first view. You know, race doesn't matter. You know, we've elected a black president, and as I said early on, there have been arguments made in the Supreme Court. Why do we need Title VII? Why do we need Section 2 or Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act? We've elected a black president. Arguments are being made now saying the race is no longer an issue. Number one. No, I know, but I'm getting to it. So that becomes another aspect of it as well. And I think the reality is that people like Clarence Thomas and Herman Cain have a lot of people who see them not as black men, but as leaders, as people who believe, who express their point of view. And those people, I would say, see themselves as raceless, right? It's not as if I'm supporting Clarence Thomas because he's a conservative black, although we heard some of that about Herman Cain, a conservative black. They see them as raceless. They're part of our view of being anti-government, anti-empowerment of all these individuals, spending more government money. And so race is not an issue in people's support for Herman Cain. He wouldn't be as strong a candidate if the same kind of racial tinge was on him. And the irony, as you'll see, is that race is an issue with President Obama. Because even things that he say that have nothing to do with race directly may have an implication in people's minds about how they would respond to it. Yes? She's going to go ahead and finish it.
A short example, and then the question is yes. Because I'd really like to hear more about what you're saying about this from your perspective. Thus the short example. Roscoe Lee Brown in the 70s. Group of us were meeting. I was in television at the time, and we were talking about issues of blackness.
Mm-hmm.
And Roscoe said, well, you know, when I'm not a black man in this way. And so then one of the brothers said, are you trying to tell me that when you look in the mirror first thing in the morning, you don't see a black man? And he smiled and he said, only if he's standing behind me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm asking you, when you have Obama, Cain, and Clarence Thomas in the same virtual space, you're not going to use the category of race to begin to make distinctions among them. And so at that point, the conundrum of race would be that if you use those categories, it would be counterproductive. So I'm asking you, at what point discourse on race becomes counterproductive and thus a conundrum? That's the question I'm trying to ask.
It really doesn't become counterproductive in my view. I think it becomes counterproductive if we don't talk about it. I think that's our big barrier. We don't talk about it enough. And the same sort of Roscoe Brown perspective we heard articulated in California by another African American who made it very clear that my children, I don't see them as black. This is an African American man who was on the border regions and had a big impact on getting rid of affirmative action in California, right? And that whole attitude tells you that his sense that we're past that, right? And my sense is that if we're going to have that real conversation about race, it has to be with people who are not of us necessarily, who have not the same view. We have our own internal struggles, but I remember some post-election conversations with people about how they voted in a particular place in the South. Going to one white couple's home and saying, how did you vote? And this one farmer went to his wife and got her information that came back out. And he said, how did you vote in 2008? He said, we voted for the nigger, right? Now, the first thing you want to do is say, gosh, that's outrageous. No, it's not outrageous, because that means we're taking a step forward. He voted against his view of race for somebody who we thought was the better candidate. And I'd rather hear him say that than to hear him say we voted for our race, right? He voted against his instincts, but for his judgment about what's best for the country, which is where I'm trying to get. That doesn't mean we're totally post-racial. We have to recognize it and understand it. And there's a remarkable difference between Clarence Thomas, remarkable difference between, I'm not going to call Clarence Thomas or Herman Cain and Uncle Tom. Other people do. They might call Barack Obama and Uncle Tom, right? I think that's the wrong kind of conversation to have if we're going to make some progress at all. And the conundrum is that race, let me just give you an example. In South Carolina, we were there campaigning for Senator Obama against Senator Hillary Clinton. And when Obama stood up to give his acceptance of winning the primary, it was a largely white audience, and they were cheering. They kept saying, you know, cheering, race doesn't matter, race doesn't matter, race doesn't matter. And their point of view is that we're supporting the best person there, but to hear whites say race doesn't matter in South Carolina had a dual effect, because a lot of the African Americans who supported Barack Obama after they met Michelle Obama was that race did matter, right, in a positive way. But it wasn't the only factor, but saying that here's somebody where race does matter. We have a level of pride. And as I said a couple of nights ago, the same thing happened in Minneapolis, when some brothers with the pants hanging down and red scarves, you know, came to a poll, and there were 69 issues on the ballot, right? They had never voted before. They came to vote for Obama, right? And then they asked an African-American woman who was a judge, hey, sister, how do we vote on these other things? They had no idea, but the fact that it was transformative, we're here, and she said, well, there's a county ordinance, there are judges, there's a mayor. It was just a sense of, there was a connection, but they weren't voting just because he was a black man. They were voting because they had this you know, change and hope in their system, and hoping that it would happen. So the conundrum is that it's a positive and a negative. We can't ignore it. It's right in front of our face, and we have to confront it. We not just among ourselves, but confront it as well among other folks. Let me give you an example. Have you seen the movie The Help yet? And that is something that has a deeply divisive impact in the African American community, right? I mean, there are people who say, don't go see that because, or you've got to go see that because, right? And we're so cautious, it's hard for us to have a conversation about The Help, the same way it was hard for us to have a conversation about Roots in the 1970s. And I remember watching it, and I watched it as a young man. I was angry watching it. And I knew a lot of my white friends in college were saying, oh, I'm glad we got over that period. I said, no, look at, you know, I'm trying to say, Kinte Kunti, don't, you know, fight back, right? But their whole sense was, it was a sense of progress, and it was released. For me, it was the conundrum of race again. We saw it through different lenses. It's going on right now between the debate between Tyler Perry and Spike Lee. Or, you know, how do we define art? How do we engage race, et cetera? I get emails once a week from David Evans, who digests this stuff and has a perspective on what it means to be black in America, somebody who grew up in the South and has to deal with that now. So it's a great question, and I'd love to hear your ideas on it, because the book is not going to come out, I'll tell you, until after the election, because the issue is so explosive, and my fear is that people will take a sentence or a paragraph out of context and have me saying something that I didn't say. There have been some excellent questions, and part of my not answering them all is that I can't answer them and hurt somebody unintentionally by saying something that may be true, but will be mischaracterized, misinterpreted, or misreported. I don't know if the reporter's here from the Crimson. I'm going to deal with it in a second. But I'm not going to give Fatima any grief, but Fatima, some of you were here on Tuesday, the first night, and I said people call Barack Barry and how he went from Barry to Barack, right? The Crimson said, I call Barack Barry, that I know him as Barry. I've never called him Barry, right? And so that's an honest mistake, right? But the reality is that I said, when did I say that? Right, last night I talked about the fact how things could be misinterpreted and could have impact. Jokingly about with the president, you know, can I give up a Supreme Court clerkship? Can I give up $100,000 salaries and go back to Chicago and be a community organizer? And I said, Barack, yes, you can. There was a he laughed, right? And then I said, this didn't start in the 1990s. This started in the 1960s with the United Farm Workers in California, si se puede. But the reporter never put si se puede in there. They said, Ogletree said, Barack never recognized. I mean, that's why I'm sort of careful in what I say. I would love to have a longer conversation with you, but not among my friends. Microphone? You have a microphone? Yeah, a bill?
This may also appear in the newspaper, but you made a very, very important prediction tonight.
Make sure it appears in the newspaper said by Bill Wilson, not by Charles Ogletree.
Right. And I want you to elaborate on that prediction. You said that the health care bill will very likely be reaffirmed by the Supreme Court. That made my, I hope you're true. I hope that's true. And would you just elaborate a little bit more on that and also indicate the number of judges who are likely to reaffirm it? I'm really going to put you on the spot.
No, I'll tell you the number, the second question, number of judges, 6 to 8.
6 to 8.
I'm not, so you can figure out who those are. I didn't say all 9. 6 to 8, right? That's the number, right? And why? Because the way, again, we talked about this last night, communication, how the press frames it. They even call it Obamacare, right? As in a pejorative way. Let's see when it's affirmed, and I think it will be affirmed, if it's going to be called Obamacare in a positive way, that he's done something that's been transformative for the country. So here's the reason I say it. It's not a liberal conservative issue about whether you give people health care or not, even though that's the way it's been framed. The question is that under the Commerce Clause, which has influence on a lot of things that the federal government and state governments can do, the courts have interpreted the Commerce Clause as giving Congress enormous power to do things. Like they can charge you tolls on roads, whether you like it or not, right? It's just a whole series. They can regulate how much you charge for certain fruit and vegetables in a particular place. They can regulate the costs from going from place to place. At some point, they're going to have to decide, can the state of New Mexico, which doesn't have the Great Lakes, force the state of Michigan, which has water, in the water rights argument, can New Mexico, which Bill Richardson, the former governor, supported, be able to get water from Michigan because it's national water and not state water? I mean, that's the kind of things that they have to say. It's not illogical. It's going to be, what do we mean by regulation? And my sense is that if you look at the law, the Supreme Court has a lot of hooks. I'm not going to tell them what to say. I'm going to write a piece for the Bay State Banner after they decide, not before, because, but they could decide, Bill, actually to not decide by saying this doesn't take effect until 2014. That's a conservative point of view. I don't mean politically conservative. It's that we don't have to decide this now. We'll hear all these arguments, all the differences between the 11th Circuit and the 1st Circuit and the D.C. Circuit and the 4th Circuit and the 6th Circuit. We can hear all that. And we can still decide, you know what, as we look at this is not ripe, and we don't decide issues that are not ripe. And this says that aspects of this law don't take place until 2014. They could kick it aside, and that could be unanimous, right? Doesn't mean that they won't get to the merits on one aspect after 2014. That's one way. I'm not saying they're going to go that way. That's one way that's interesting. It takes away, are they forced or not? We can't decide that. That's 2014. It's not now, right? Another point of view is they can say this is strictly about the Commerce Clause, and government has the power to regulate a lot of things. And the question, this is an apple like an orange? They're both fruit, right? Or is an apple like an asparagus? Well, no, so the apple analogy may not hold the asparagus analogy, and therefore we find it unconstitutional. I think that's going to be hard because they've given enormous discretion to government to decide how the Commerce Clause applies, and I think that's going to be a part of it. The other part that's interesting, if you look at constitutional scholars. My colleague, Charles Freed, who was the Solicitor General under Reagan, the government's lawyer, top lawyer, he has written opinions already, written op-eds. He says, this is a simple case of the Commerce Clause. I have no doubt, he said, that the Supreme Court is going to uphold the health care law. Whether they agree with, whether people think it's left or right, the Commerce Clause is exact. I would be arguing as Solicitor General, he's saying, that this law is constitutional for these reasons. And when you have Charles Freed, who doesn't step into issues like that, step into it, that's something different. Now, let me give you an example why this is an easier case to decide than another one that they'll be deciding. They're going to be deciding the constitutionality of affirmative action. And that is about, that's a left-right issue. And I'm unfortunately of the view that we might lose affirmative action in 2012 as we know it, right? There was silence from 1978 with Bakke, and then finally 2003, Gratz and Magruder. Justice O'Connor, who in her 20 years on the Supreme Court had not been in favor of race issues, right? Some gender issues, but not race. This was her seminal case. And she put one line in there to help get it signed. We expect 25 years from now that this, diversity will no longer be necessary. Now let me tell you about law. If people read Gratz versus Grutter, I'm sorry for taking so long, but it's important. If you go and read Gratz versus Grutter, there's a dissent from Justice Clarence Thomas on this same issue. And he says, and I agree with the majority, he's in the minority, that in 25 years, racial classifications will be unconstitutional. That's not what she said, but who's going to be there in 25 years? Thomas or O'Connor? O'Connor's gone. And if Thomas is in the majority, that dissent could rise quickly. We saw that in 2007 with Chief Justice John Roberts in the two cases in the Supreme Court, one from the Ninth Circuit from Seattle and one from the Sixth Circuit from Louisville, where parents had voluntarily said, we want children in different parts of the state to get a quality education in elementary. This is not colleges, admissions, and law schools and other professional schools. We want them to get equal opportunity for education. And the Sixth Circuit, the highest court in at Louisville, and the Ninth Circuit, the highest court in Seattle, both agreed that these plans were constitutional. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, said no, led by Chief Justice John Roberts. And he said, the only way to avoid discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, right? And so he's drawn a line in the sand about what he feels. That's not going to change. And so that one I can say with unfortunate some confidence will lead to the demise of affirmative action, even though I suspect, as he did even in that case, he voted with the majority. Justice, the middle of the road justice who made an enormous amount of difference. It'll be very interesting to see whether he will be able to, I'm forgetting his name, from California, and then Kennedy, Justice Anthony Kennedy said, we can't say we can't consider race. We have to look at isolation, and we have to look at stigma. And his point was there still are reasons to consider race, but not the way it was applied in this case. I'm against these two cases, but I'm not saying that race should never be considered. So he agreed with the majority's decision, but not with their analysis. And so will he take this and make something? I don't know, and I'm not convinced, because the parties, here's interesting, before in Bakke, before in Brown, even before in the 2007 case, it was black versus white, sort of, right? Or Hispanic versus white. In this case, it's an Asian American who says, this plan in Texas allows you to admit African Americans, Latinos, and others, and I'm excluded as an Asian American. And so the race issue gets more complicated, right? And you can see there's race on both sides. I think it's brewing for an unfortunate decision. Yes, David? How we doing?
150 years ago, with the beginning of the Civil War, most of the Confederate soldiers owned no slaves, owned no land, and were illiterate, yet they went out and fought for causes that were frankly against their best interests. Have we come again to that in this country, in that many of those who stand against President Obama are actually fighting against their best interests, especially in health care?
And I wish I could make that a complicated answer. The answer is yes. And I say that not, pro-Obama in some sense, but David, if you think about it, think about, Mitch McConnell said it. We're going to make this president a one-term president. I don't care what he does, no matter how good it looks, or whether it seems crazy for us to oppose it. We have to be unified and oppose it in every way. And the reason it tells you it's problematic, despite the small approval of a multi-billion-dollar package in jobs, they vetoed voted against the bill that would have given jobs to police, to fire workers, to teachers. Now, it's not blacks, poor, Hispanics, right? Undocumented workers. Think about that. You're voting against your own self-interest in terms of Congress, but then there are people out there saying, we don't want the government to interfere in my lives. Huh? Don't you have Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security? It's just absurd. And I'm not sure if the people don't know the difference or don't care, right? Because it's hard to say we don't want government in our lives. We do want government in our lives. We don't want government in our private lives to interfere without our allowing that to happen, but we do want government to give us something because we pay a lot for that to happen. And that's part of the challenge as well. And I think that's part of it as well. And it's interesting that you see people come out and support President Obama's idea that the rich who make over $1 million should pay more taxes. And some pay none, or very little. And the interesting thing is that there aren't a whole lot of millionaires who are saying, he's right, I should pay more taxes. There are some, we've heard some, very prominent. Why am I paying fewer taxes than my secretary who makes 1% of what I make, right? But the whole idea is that that's been also considered a negative thing, and the question that was raised earlier on first Tuesday night, well, is Obama a socialist because he's doing all these things? It just begins to reinforce the way in which people respond to some of these things. But it is against self-interest in many respects. We've got to figure out how to change that. Yes, you got a microphone?
Well, why don't we make this, there's a reception just a few minutes from now, and we're going to have you still available to answer questions. So why don't we take two more, and then the questions we don't get to, hopefully you can engage with Charles later.
So I'm getting these three. I see Preston. A brother back here has written a book about Obama, and then going to a good brother back there.
The question
It's on.
The question I'm going to ask might not be capable of being answered, but I want to go back to Tandeka and ask, what's the usefulness of the category of race at this particular time in our history?
Well, that's a very good question, and in fact, Richard Ford, a Harvard Law School graduate and who's just written a book about that, criticizing the way we say too much or too little about race, right? I think it's useful because we have laws against discrimination. And in reality, it's hard to say we've solved the problem. No one's discriminated against on the basis of race or gender or sexual orientation. We still have it. It's still, that's why race is important, that category, to give people that sense. It's also important because, I'm trying to not mention a name, I won't mention a name. There's a Harvard Law School graduate who said, when Derek Bell came to Harvard, I was amazed to see all these black students and some white students demonstrating the lack of diversity. I never even noticed that there was no one black teaching at Harvard. This is a very progressive guy, right? And so the sense that we could almost close our eyes and pretend that race doesn't matter. And some work we've done on unconscious bias is not race but just gender. There was a study done about selecting great artists for the opera based on their auditioning. And the studies show that 70% of the women or something like that who auditioned didn't get the position. Then they put them behind a curtain and didn't see the race. This is the flip side of it. And it turned out just the opposite. that women were selected in higher numbers because their race and their gender weren't used against them. And so it's one of those things that has that significance in some respects. And it still matters because you've seen the book. A lot of people in here are in the book that I wrote about Gates, about the number of black men, for example, professional black men, who have found themselves at a disadvantage because of race. Prominent black men are John Hope Franklin, Eric Holder, our Attorney General, Johnny Cochran, people that you know, but also Alan Counter, who I saw here somewhere before, and a whole series of people have had that sort. Doctors, lawyers have found that their color trumps everything else about them in terms of how they're viewed in a society. So I like your optimism. I got a brilliant question in upstate Pennsylvania, Susquehanna University. She said, I know we're not post-racial, but shouldn't we not change our policies until we're post-racism? Not post-racial, but post-racism. And my unfortunate response was, I'm not sure we're going to be post-racism. I certainly hope that will happen. I just think it's so deeply embedded with David's question. It has nothing to do with class. Poor white people have views about wealthy black people. If you talk about Jim Crow segregation, the reality is that no matter how high you rose as an African American, you still were segregated. No matter how low you were as a white, you had more power to do things. So it's hard to say in my lifetime we can get beyond it, but I do hope I think your question might have been a little bit different, but the whole idea, I can't see eliminating it. And here's my example. It's a very practical example. This is Thurgood Marshall. He said 40 years ago, he says, I'm not a big proponent of the melting pot. That is, that we come from all parts of the world, come to the United States, and we lose our identity. He says, I don't believe in the melting pot. He says, I believe in a salad bowl. I said, what do you mean by that? He says, well, if you look at a salad has lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, a whole series of things that make a difference. And you need all of them to make a salad wholesome, but they each have their own identity. Can you be black and American too? Can you be Latina and American too? And that's a complicated aspect, but I think I would like to see somebody run for office. We see who they are, not behind a closed window. We vote for them in spite of their ethnicity, in spite of their gender, in spite of their sexual orientation, because we think they're the best that can happen. And on whether or not, okay, Pam, I'm gonna stop. But whether we're getting closer to a post-racial, I'm thinking of my 3 granddaughters. And I don't think they see race the way that my parents allowed me to see it, or that they saw it, right? It's very complicated. I don't think they see themselves, they might see themselves as brown skin and somebody else as pink skin, but it's not the black-white. And on the one hand, that's a good thing. On the other hand, I wonder when we're gonna get beyond race, when someone calls them the N-word for the first time. And they're going to be stunned like, I thought I was one of you, a 3rd grader, a girl, a soccer player. And so I think that's, I'm going to talk about that in the book with the optimism. I hope that it will change, but the reality is that we've got a long way to go, and I appreciate your help. Walter Carrington? Right here, and then Walter Carrington, last question.
Thank you. You mentioned that one of the issues that will decide the 2012 election will be the turnout, whether the people who were enthusiastic Obama supporters before will turn out. But it seems to me that here the question of race very much comes in because of the voter suppression laws that are being enacted throughout the country by Republican governors. Now the question is, will there be a vigorous effort on the part of the Democrats to overturn those laws? Because if they don't, it seems to me we will be back in a kind of poll tax situation. And that, it seems to me, will make race probably the most dominant issue in the election, because so many blacks and others will not be able to vote.
Well, I'm going to give 3 responses, and they are of increasing significance. The first is that, and this is a small part of the answer, is that a number of the initiatives to change the voting rights and voter ID rights are on the ballot in 2012, so it won't affect 2012. That's a minority of them, but some of them are on the ballot. And so if folks come out, that can have an impact. So that's the little bit of good news. The legal strategy is an important one, but I'm of the view, as a lawyer, that trying to win these cases in court between now and primaries and the general election is not the, I'm going to say only, I'm not going to say the best, not the only strategy. A strategy has to be, which is counterintuitive and different from every strategy in law that we've seen in the past, we have to get people to comply with those laws. We have to take people from city to county to state and say, here's how you get a government ID. And I think I'm right on this. If you go to the state of Georgia, for example, as I recall, we had this in 2008. If you are going to Georgia Tech or University of Georgia, you have a government-issued ID. If you're going to Morehouse or Spelman, you don't. Those are private schools, right? And something as simple as that, like, you know, we know that I'd rather everybody get registered and address that voter ID. Here's the scariest part of 2012. It was wonderful. Let me just say this. I'm taking longer than I should. Here's the scary part. I give Reverend Jesse Jackson enormous credit in '84 and '88. You may remember, now he won South Carolina and Michigan and other places, but it was a winner take all. So if somebody got 52% and he got 48%, it meant nothing in those states that he lost. He changed those laws. That helped Obama tremendously in his campaign in 2008 and going around from state to state and making a big difference in the primary and ultimately in the general election. But here's the second point, and that is that we benefited from the liberalization of voting rights in 2008. It was part of the mark of the Obama campaign. The liberalization meant that in Florida, folks can vote over a 2 or 3 week period, not one day. And what I saw in the primaries was disastrous in the primaries when you had 1 day for the ability to vote. One was the situation in Harlem where Barack Obama got no votes, and then they figured out 2 weeks later, oh, we made a mistake, and he did get votes. And the second was I went down to South Carolina, my wife and my daughter went down to South Carolina, and we were, it was hard to say it, but a lot of African Americans, they don't watch TV, they don't read the newspapers. They had been voting in Precinct 7 at this elementary school for 20 years. And they didn't know that last October, before January 2008, in October, they changed the polling places. So they went to that same precinct and tried to vote and were angry. I've been a registered voter for 20 years. I always vote. And what did the folks do there to calm them down? They gave them provisional ballots. It looked just like a ballot. You checked it off for who you wanted, and they put it in a box. Those ballots were never counted. There's nothing illegal about that. It's the folks at the polling places trying to save themselves from assaults, right? Give them a ballot. But you can't count a person who lives in precinct 13 who votes in precinct 11. That's illegal. And so they put them in this box, but they never count them. And that's why I think it hurt us a little bit with one-day election. But in other states, when you had multiple days, if you've had that problem on day one, you can fix it if you have a 3-week period. So that's going to be the area. So my point is I'm counterintuitive, Walter, that we have to get people to vote. There's a website, if you go to the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, they have something called the Map of Shame. Of our website, the Charles Hamilton Houston website, charleshamiltonhouston.org, it has a website that has the website that says the Map of Shame, where 35 states have changed their laws. And here's what they say, which is true. More than 5 million people right now will not be eligible to vote under these new laws who voted in 2008. And you know who's a big part of that class? Seniors. Because seniors have a government ID when they're driving. But when they stop driving, they don't need to renew their license. And so we have to get them a non-licensed government ID, state ID, to vote in 2012. And they don't know if they're not watching, the 6 o'clock news or 11 o'clock news. They want to do what they've done for decades, go around the corner to the elementary school and vote. It won't count in 2012 if they don't have the right ID. And in many places, they don't even ask for ID in 2004, 2008. That's not going to happen in 2012. it's changed dramatically, and that's one of the issues I'll be writing about, the impact of that. And it means that we have to do a different kind of work, the same way that Dr. King brought people to march in Montgomery after the bus boycott, the same way that he brought people to march in Mississippi and other places. That kind of effort has to happen, and I have to say that to his credit, the president has been a big part of it. I'm told my time is up. Thank you all very much.